So this was a quote from 1977, but I think it probably still stands today, that it says, "Often there is a very narrow range of information found in occupational literature, restricted to training, work, task descriptions, qualifications required, prospects of advancement and economic rewards, and often the psychosocial aspects are missing." But actually, if you look at what makes people happy at work, it tends to be the psychosocial aspects. You know, a lot of you have talked about colleagues, and I did as well, and that's the sort of thing that makes an enormous difference. I was just going to tell you about, you know, did I say before that I've written this book this year? I've written a book that's just been published into the fashion industry. And what the publishers asked me to do was come up with 50 different jobs in the fashion industry. So it was really sort of really broad, everything to do with fashion. And I was just thinking when I was putting this together about how I found all the information for that. And one thing I use quite a lot, which I'll show you later, is the Prospects website. I don't know if that's one you've come across. Now, I've also written some of the job profiles for the Prospects website before, and you're terribly, terribly restricted. You know, they're very clear about exactly what they want you to write and how many words and what your sources of information should be, and what you need to say, really. It's almost a case that they sort of give you a template, you have to fill in the blanks. And in one way that makes it a really great source of information because everything is pretty accurate, the quality standards are pretty good. But what it doesn't give you is any flavour of the jobs. And that's because when you're writing for AdCast, they're not interested in the flavour of the jobs, because if you talk to one person, their experience could be incredibly different from somebody else's, and that could be based on them, or it could be based on the organisation, or, you know, the time, or, you know, things. So I use the Prospects website for the sort of facts and figures about it, but then what I did is I talked to people, and I found that way more useful, really, than reading any sort of careers literature. So it was, I mean, I was asked for all sorts of obscure jobs in fashion that I didn't know about, like a fashion shoot producer. So I would have to find a fashion shoot producer. And then I ended up talking to one who was just incredibly lovely and really interesting about her job, but was also able to say, you know, my job is a bit different from other people's jobs, in the way that I'm sure when you worked in those recruitment agencies, you would have been able to say, this is quite different from other recruitment agencies. So I think the written information about sort of occupational jobs and areas and things is often really, really important and really useful, but it often isn't what makes the difference. So I think the more you talk to people, really, the more you'll build up your own sense of it. So, coming back to sort of what you need to know and where to start, I think these are probably the three places to start in terms of building up your own body of information. So first of all, what are the popular choices? And you will get a sense of that within the first couple of weeks of working somewhere. What are the job titles or the education routes that come up time and time again? And they will of course change depending on where you work. So in my first job where I worked for Essex Career Service, there was I knew a lot about childcare and I knew a lot about physiotherapy, which seemed to be the two most popular jobs at that time. They were also quite interested in koi carp fishing, so that was a lot. So those are the three things that were going on in Essex in 1995. Then I worked in SOAS, which is the School of Oriental and African Studies, in 2001, and I knew about jobs in the UN and jobs in, you know, places like Amnesty and Oxfam backwards, because that was what the students wanted to know about. So that's brilliant. If you can work out what, I don't know, the top 5 or the top 10 most popular choices are, and then do some research on those, most places conform to that, you know, that 80-20 rule that comes up so often. So 80% of your clients will be interested in 20% of the jobs. Yeah, so if you can find out what those 20% are, and that's quite easy to do. You will pick that up really quickly. But you can ask colleagues. If you get your colleagues to say, what are the 5 most common options that people come with, then that's a really good place for you to start researching. The next one is about local opportunities. The koi carp thing, that was because near where we were in Essex, there was a big koi carp fishery or something, where lots of people were employed. So find out what the local opportunities are, because that's hugely helpful in terms of suggesting sort of realistic options to young people if you know what's going on locally. And again, you can find that information quite easily. Flick through a local paper and you'll see what jobs come up often. Most places that you work will have some kind of bulletin board or some sort of vacancy magazine or something, and have a look at those. And again, talk to colleagues. And then the third important one is careers where early choices have an impact. So if you're thinking about doing medicine, you need to choose separate sciences, or at least double science, when you're making your GCSE option choices in year 9. So that's a really important one for you to know about, so that you can advise the young people early on. And teaching's another one. You know, if you want to be a primary school teacher, your degree, if you do a degree and then a PGCE, your degree needs to be in a national curriculum subject. So if you're seeing a year 11 student who wants to do media studies, psychology and sociology A-levels, they're all really sound A-levels and quite interesting for primary teaching, but they're not going to enable you to do a degree that allows you to be a primary teacher at the end of it. So those sorts of jobs, now it's hard to know what they are, but if you talk to colleagues, perhaps you ought to be a visitor to them actually, that would be quite helpful, wouldn't it? Then that's the sort of thing that can help. So those, I would say, are the 3 places to start. Does that make some sense as a starting point for your own knowledge development? So I think the sort of information you need to have at your fingertips, you can split into the idea about facts and stories. So facts are your requirements and your routes. So what are the training courses you need to do? When are the deadlines? What GCSEs do you need to do that? So what are the sort of factual requirements? And that's really useful for you to have at your fingertips, and obviously it's really useful for your clients to know, so you can either direct them to where you found it, or you can tell them if it was appropriate. The stories, I think, is sometimes where careers guidance practitioners can have their sort of added value.
Okay.
Shall I? Okay. That's where you have your added value. So I think if you can get some stories, and these stories really you get from people you know, then that's where you can really make things come alive. I remember going along to a employer visit with a tax consultant. And do you all know the story about Jaffa cakes? I'm going to tell you about Jaffa cakes, as with the mudlogging. This is, one particular story that's really stayed with me. Because I'd always thought, for my sins, that tax law was a bit dull. And so I went along to this visit with a whole bunch of careers advisors and the sort of Institute of tax lawyers, or whatever they call it, talking about it. And they told me this story about Jaffa cakes, which was in the press at the time. So, the question is, a Jaffa cake, is it a cake or is it a biscuit? Now, if it's a cake, you don't need to pay any VAT on it, because cakes are not luxury items. If it's a biscuit, it's a chocolate biscuit. And therefore, you do need to pay VAT on it, because the chocolate makes it a luxury biscuit. So there was this huge court case all round, is a Jaffa cake a cake or a biscuit? Because it had, millions and millions of pounds worth of implications to, I think it's McVitie's, isn't it, who make Jaffa cakes? And eventually, what they decided, I can't even remember which it is, I think they decided it was a cake. It was a cake. They decided it was a cake because it went hard when you let it out rather than soft. So if you think about it, you leave a digestive biscuit out and it'll go soft, won't it? But you leave a bit of fruitcake out, it'll go hard. And that was how they eventually decided on that. And I just thought that was such a great example that for me made this whole, frankly, to my mind, dry and dull area really come alive, and I really had an understanding of the sorts of things you would get involved in. I mean, that might be a more sort of user-friendly example than most elements of tax law, but I think it's stories like that, and then if you can tell a story like that to your client, then I think it sort of makes it come alive in a way that reading, something a little bit dry on an ACAS website that sort of won't do for you. So that's brilliant. So your own personal experience is one probably the most important, isn't it? And just sort of following on from that, In my old job, when I ran a career service, I made all my careers advisors do 1 day of job shadowing every year. And we had a sort of staff development, there was a kind of staff development thing. And that was an enormously helpful process for them. So I did a day of job shadowing working as a runner for a post-production agency. And post-production was something I didn't really know a great deal about, but having spent a day doing it, and even being a runner, I suppose, was something I didn't really know very much about. But I spent a day doing it, and I ran around Soho, and I got people lunch, and I made people cups of tea, and I had a look in the studios, and I talked to people about what was going on. And it was an enormously valuable experience for me as a careers advisor to get some of the stories. So you can have done it yourself. If it's something that comes up a lot and you think this is really something I don't know much about, you can arrange to go and do it. I mean, I did it just for 1 day. You could do longer, but that's an option. I was thinking about television. I think television is sometimes a really good, not always good, is it? But it's quite an easy way to find out about jobs. I don't know, you watch Holby City, and you have some sense of what it's like. Now, I mean, you've got to take it with a bit of a pinch of salt, haven't you? Because I'm sure it's not really like that. I'm sure that as the patients die, I'm sure the team members of staff aren't really having those kinds of conversations. But it can be something that makes you think about things, and it certainly might be the sort of thing that alerts you to different kinds of jobs, the kinds of roles that exist within a hospital. You also need to be aware with television is that your clients will be watching it, and that could well be their major source of occupational information. So it is true that I think whatever there's something, volcanology. I remember after there was some film, really big film in about 1997, all about volcanoes. I remember, and I didn't see it, and I hadn't heard of it, and I had this spate of kids coming through saying, I'm really interested in volcanology. And the first time I thought, I don't even know what it is. And then it turned out it was all a response to this film. So I think that kind of thing can inform or possibly misinform students or young people. I've got a few. I'm not going to go through all of those. Sorry, that's a bit hideous. So you can have a look at yourselves. Let me just think. The best ones, I think, are networking. So people you know. If you can do some work experience, it's absolutely invaluable, because I do think what you've done yourself, you know a lot about. Clients, I think you get a lot of information from the people that you're interviewing. Lots of organisations run visits, or you can go and visit them. If you phone up and you say, I'm a careers advisor, there are loads of young people at the school I work in who are interested in being physiotherapists, but I don't know much about it. Could I come down and talk to you? People, for the most part, are very happy. When I was doing this research for this book I wrote, I was astonished at how lovely and supportive and welcoming people were. And at the beginning I tried to go through sort of friends of friends or contacts of contacts. But eventually, I mean, when I was, I had to find a denim designer, and I didn't happen to know any denim designers. So I would just put a call out on LinkedIn, or phone up organisations and say, do you have a denim designer there? And people were astonishingly helpful. And I think if you say I'm a careers advisor, there's a real sense that this is a good thing if careers advisors are well informed, their young people are well informed. And people in general really enjoy talking about themselves. So I think if you can, it's quite flattering, isn't it? Because you're kind of saying, all these young people want to be like you, tell them all about it, it's quite nice. And people just don't often get the chance to sit and talk about themselves. So I think people quite enjoy it. So although it may make you feel, I couldn't possibly cold call and ask them, try it. And my guess is it won't be nearly as bad as you imagine, so you can give that a go. On the other side, I've got some websites there. They're not all websites that I would use. I think of those, the prospects.ac.uk is the one that I most use. I think that's quite broad. I mean, it is focused on graduate jobs, so it doesn't have everything on it, but it has quite a broad spectrum of jobs. I think that's quite a good one. Right, let's think for a second about what makes information giving effective. Some of them, you talked about it being relevant before, didn't you? How to make it relevant. I think that's one important thing. Anything else that makes information giving particularly effective? The information needs to be relevant and appropriate. So it's all about finding out where they are and giving them the next step. Have any of you come across, he's a sort of child development psychologist called Vygotsky? I'll just say this phrase that he used was this idea of scaffolded learning, and I really like that image. The idea that you, as a guidance practitioner, you're kind of almost providing some scaffolding to help your client step up. So you need to know exactly where they are and exactly where they're going next, and you provide the scaffolding for them to climb up. So you really need to find out where they are, what do they know so far, and then get them to think about what's the next stage up, and then that's the information that you need to look at. The information needs to be specific, so saying you need very good grades to be a corporate lawyer isn't enough. You need to say, these are specifically the grades, these are specifically the subjects. You need to be clear. Going back to that example I gave you earlier, if you feel you haven't been clear, it's absolutely fine to say, I'm not sure I've been terribly clear, and highlight 1 or 2 points for them to take away. It's also a really good idea to try and check their understanding, which you can do at the time. If you give them a little spiel about some particular piece of information, you can say to them, now I'm not sure I was terribly clear, could I get you just to feed back to me what you can remember about what I've just said? If you phrase it like that, then you don't want to sound as though you're testing them. But if you can phrase it by saying, I'm not sure I was terribly clear, then they're not on trial, you are. Or you can come back to it at the action planning stage. When you're towards the end of the interview, when you're thinking about the sort of what next, what are we going to do next, you can say to them, okay, based on what we were talking before, are there any sort of particular things you need to go away and research? So you need to make sure it's clear. And it's all about making sure that the information you give is useful to the client. That's really the only thing that matters. And if they only go away with one piece of information, even if you've got 100 that you could have given them, if they go away with one piece of information, but that piece of information is appropriate and it's relevant and it's specific and it's clear, then that's fantastic, job done. Just a few sort of more specific things there for you to think about. Using short words and sentences. Avoiding jargon, and don't ever forget that there can always be terms that you don't think are jargon, but the client thinks are jargon. Yeah, so be very careful about what language you use. Repeat information, particularly the stuff that's important. Be specific and concrete, give examples. Try and be positive about it, so you're suggesting what to do rather than what not to do. Summarise and pause. Vary your presentation, or at least the tone of voice. And then provide some written backup. So you could scribble down, you get them to write down on their action planner website, or you could email them afterwards if that's part of the culture of where you work. You could email them afterwards with some links, or you could even provide a summary if you thought that was appropriate, that you would email them afterwards. Right, so now thinking about what information do you give. I've said before that less is more, so you need to limit what you give, and you also need to think very carefully about what's going to be useful to the client and what is going to be the thing that moves them one step on. Yeah, don't talk too far in the future. Here are a few things that you need to find out before you decide what information to give. So you always need to find out what the client knows already, so that should almost always be one of your very early questions. Whatever it is they want to go into, you ask them, so tell me what you know about this. And if they don't come up with very much, you can prompt them to, well, tell me what sorts of things you think you'd be doing in that job. Tell me what sorts of training you would need to get there, so you can get them to narrow it down quite specifically. You need a sense of how realistic they are. Are they basing their, sense of being a doctor entirely on Holby City, or is there some more behind it? How good do you think their research skills are? You remember earlier we were talking about, you know, to what extent do you tell them stuff and to what extent do you make them go and research themselves? And then I suppose there's the middle one, which has also been mentioned so far, which is about could you look together? Yeah, and your decision about which of those three to do will in part be based on how good you think their research skills are. So if you have concerns about their ability to go away and do something, and you think it's really important, then don't leave it to chance. You know, make sure you either tell them or it's something that you could look together. So that's how important the information is, how significant the information is to them. If it's an area they've just sort of, you know, and by the way, I'm quite vaguely interested in something, you don't want to spend a lot of the interview talking about that. How much time is left in the session? How easy is the information to find? So the sort of facts and figures about, you know, grades and routes and tasks are probably relatively easy for your client to find, but the sort of psychosocial stuff about what's it really like, what kind of person, how competitive is it, might be a little bit more difficult for them to find, so that might be something you'd be more likely to add yourselves. And then finally, how urgent it is. You know, if there's a deadline coming up in the next few weeks, that perhaps would be something you wouldn't get them to go away and find out by themselves, because it might take them a week to think about it, a week to find it, and then you've only left them a week to fill in their form. So that could be something that you say, okay, the deadline's actually next Wednesday, rather than leaving them to find out themselves. Does that make sense? Now, I've sort of alluded to this as we've gone through, but I think it's worth reiterating that I think the best use of your information is not to give it directly. I think if you give information directly, you can only get away with giving a tiny amount of information because that's all your client will be able to take in. And you run the risk, if you tell them, you run the risk that they're not paying attention or they're not listening at that moment. So I think giving information is almost your last resort in terms of how you use information in a guidance interview. Really, you ought to be using the information to help you decide how to steer the interview. Remember, you're in charge of the process. So you might use some information about how very competitive it is to become a barrister, to steer the conversation into a plan B, or what else can you do with a law degree? Yeah, it can influence your questioning. So the example of somebody who wants to go into PR and there's a lot of writing in PR. So rather than saying there's a lot of writing in PR, you ask a question like, tell me how you feel about writing. How much writing do you do? Is this something you enjoy? You know, how would you feel about having that as a major part of your job? So you're getting them to make the link between the task, the writing, and their own experience of it. So if somebody, when I was thinking about retail, when I was thinking of going to M&S's graduate training scheme, if somebody had said to me, how would you feel about working in a shop? That would have been a really good question. And if they'd said, you know you'd be working in a shop, I'd have said, yeah, I do. But if they'd said, but how do you feel about working in a shop? That might have been the kind of thing that might have prompted me to think, I'd hate it, don't make me do it. You can also use the information that you've got, the knowledge that you've got, to help you decide whether to and how much to challenge. I'm trying to think of an example of that. But if you know that an area is particularly competitive, or if if you're very keen, if they want to be a footballer, you know that's madly competitive, you're very keen that they come up with a plan B, they say, no, I don't really want a plan B. If you know it's really competitive, you might push that a bit. You might push that, I really think it'd be a good idea to have a plan B. Tell me why you don't want one. So it can help you decide how firmly to challenge people. Right, just one more to go, and this is a piece of research that was done in 2008 by Hexu, who are the people behind the Prospects website. And they were looking at social demographics, so they're looking at working class students. Now these were university students, but my guess is that their findings are quite possibly applicable to all social classes and probably all ages of people. So first of all, these students valued informal, or what they called hot information, rather than formal information. So that's not I read it in a book, but I talked to somebody who does this, and this is what they said. I think that tends to be much more credible. The use of limited information contributed to students' lack of understanding about issues relating to graduate employment. So actually, if you only give them a little bit of information, that can end up confusing them. I think that's what that means, that actually you need to give them quite a broad range of information sometimes to make the point, to make them really understand the point. And then the last one there is that many, I think this feeds into the first idea about this hot information really, many students did not relate what they read in careers literature to their own situation. So there was a sense of, well, that happened to that person, that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen to me. I just thinking about that. I'm sorry to go on about my fashion book again, but there was one, I interviewed somebody who was a costume designer, and she had this moment, she called it a moment of serendipity, where she'd been trying quite hard to make it in costume. And then one day she was at the National Theatre Cafe, National Film Theatre Cafe on the South Bank, and there's this guy there, and he, they were just both sitting there reading, and then eventually he said, would you mind looking after my bag while I go to the loo? And they got chatting, and it turned out that he was a producer for a series of programmes for the BBC, and he was really in need of an assistant costume designer, and he was doing these sorts of auditions for it the following day. And he asked her to come along. And I just think that's a great story in a way, but you can see that as a student, you would read that and you would think, well, that's great for her, but how many of us is that really going to happen to? So I think although it's a nice story, that might not be a very sort of empowering or encouraging one to share with your students, because they might end up thinking, well, that's great, but the chances of that happening to me are really, really slim.